Okay, in terms of the stuff, deadlines are unchangeified, so closest deadline is tomorrow, end of day. And that covers exam 1, which is over part 1, quiz and assignments part 2, covering shockingly not part 2. Then exam 2, quiz and assignments part 3, a month away, or more, April 5th. And then exam 3, exam 4, quiz and assignments part 4, April 26th, end of day. And then finally the exam 5, the final covering all this stuff. Deadline's Wednesday, finals week at 5 p.m. So last time we were looking at the ad hominem fallacy, which in a way was sort of like perfect timing. If you follow politics at all, Donald Trump's former fixer, Michael Cohen, was testifying before Congress, and we saw playing out in real time kind of this battle over ad hominems. And the stuff that we talked about on Tuesday applies perfectly here, because the Republicans essentially seem to be making ad hominems because they would say, you know, first, Michael Cohen is a liar, criminal, fraud. He makes this claim about Donald Trump, therefore the claim is false. And as we saw last time in the ancient days of Tuesday, that would be simply a personal attack. This person, or circumstantial ad hominem, this person's a liar, this person's a criminal, therefore this particular claim is false. And as we saw, that sort of reasoning would be fallacious because a person's flaws or defects in general don't prove any particular claim they make is therefore false. So, for example, if someone said Michael Cohen is a liar and a criminal, Michael Cohen said that 2 + 2 is 4, therefore 2 + 2 is not 4, that would clearly be terrible reasoning. But of course people get caught up in the emotion of it, and they think, aha, I really don't like this person, they're terrible, therefore their claims are false. Now, reasonable people are making the reasonable point about credibility, which is something we talked about on Tuesday, namely if someone has qualities that raise doubts about their credibility. So in the case of Michael Cohen, yeah, it's pretty well established he lied, he was convicted of lying to Congress. He also convicted of committing various, financial fraud, establishing as a person who, is a deceiver. Also, of course, he has, going back to his circumstances, he has a motivation to come off as someone who is, who's realized that he was serving the evil empire, and now he's gone over to the rebellion on the light side, and he's converted. Because, as his critics have claimed, he stands to gain from that narrative. And so you could say all that stuff is true. And it does affect his credibility. So if someone is a liar, committed financial fraud, they're in it for potential gain, it doesn't mean any particular claim they make is false, but it does reduce their credibility. So how should we apply that in a practical sense? If you're listening to Cohen's testimony, what rational conclusions should you draw? Well, in terms of just saying Cohen's an expert, he says this is true, well, as Republicans pointed out correctly, he's a liar, he's got a motivation to say certain things, therefore, you shouldn't believe something he says just because he says it. But again, not believing is not the same as rejecting. So what we have to do is go with what he said and see if there's additional evidence. So if he says Donald Trump did this, well, as the Republicans pointed out correctly, lower credibility means he's not a reliable source. But if he says Donald Trump gave me a check for this, and he says, here's the signed check, then yeah, his credibility is low, but the fact that his credibility is low doesn't count as evidence against his claims. So both things work. Low credibility doesn't mean that you should trust them, but also doesn't prove that the person's claims are false. And so we'd have to go with the other evidence. So as a practical sense, what should we think? Well, again, the fact that Michael Cohen says it, yeah, he's a established liar, etc., so it doesn't prove it. But it doesn't disprove it. So we have to take his claims and see if there are additional evidence for that. And that's the rational way to approach it. I was waiting for somebody in Congress to say, as a mere ad hominem, let's talk about credibility, which is why we need philosophers in Congress to really bore people even more. So now, before finishing up with this stuff, anything about the new stuff, or the old stuff, before moving to the new stuff? Okay. Now, of course, closing on our ad hominems, we also have to watch out for those positive ad hominems. So if someone, for example, switching back to the Michael Cohen example, Cohen now again is, turned on Donald Trump, is presenting this narrative that he was serving the evil empire, but now he's on the side of the rebellion. And Democrats would tend to want to believe him because people who are attacking Donald Trump, they seem to be believable because that's what people want to hear. So if someone says, aha, Michael Cohen is going after Donald Trump, he's seen the light, he's part of the rebellion now, therefore his claims are true, that would also be a fallacy. Because just because we like someone's political view, their political narrative, etc., doesn't mean their claims are true. Doesn't mean they're false. Doesn't mean they're true. So we have to be careful. And the Michael Cohen example, again, provides an example of this. Just because we hate somebody doesn't mean what they're saying is not true. And just because we really like someone doesn't mean what they're saying is true. We have to go with not our politics or how we like or feel, but based on the evidence. And the reason why it's important is because if we just go by our feels, then we just end up with just this, as a practical matter, partisan politics. People who feel, hatred towards Cohen say he's lying. People who feel that he's going after their enemy, they think he's great. But we're not really settling the facts of the matter. And as a philosopher, I do believe facts matter. But I also believe people can argue they don't. So there we go. So then we finished up looking at that stuff, and now we turn to the very popular straw man. Now, straw man is super useful, super popular. And the basic structure is this, badly drawn. So this is a person's actual view, position, claim. And I'll use as a concrete example, I'll use the Democrats' Green New Deal. Or GND, as no one, I think, says. So we have the actual proposal, and it's got all kinds of stuff going on there, but one basic one is we're supposed to be carbon neutral in 10 years. And so we'll kind of use that as our focus. Now, the way the straw man works is this. Here's the actual position that someone has taken, the actual proposal, plan, etc. And to straw man it is to present in its place something distorted, exaggerated, protected. And then what a person does is, instead of attacking the real thing, they go after the distorted, exaggerated version. And hyperbole, as you might suspect, often plays a strong role here, because one way to distort or exaggerate is to use hyperbolic language to make it very extravagant. So then what the person does is they attack this distorted, exaggerated thing, so attack. Then what they do, here's where the fallacy gets going. Because of their attack on the distorted, exaggerated one, they say, therefore, this, the original, the real one, is false, defective, bad. So, again, the basic idea is, here's the person's actual position. Person crafts a distorted, exaggerated version, attacks that, and then says, aha, I've defeated the original. And of course, the reason why that doesn't work is because attacking this doesn't defeat that. Why do they call it the straw man? Well, one possible origin of it is the idea of burning people in effigy. And the idea would be one thing, they don't do it so much these days, but sometimes, where they get like a distorted cartoonish image of somebody and like set it on fire or throw rocks at it or parade it around. And of course, attacking a straw man or dummy doesn't hurt the original person, except maybe their feels. And I'd be like, oh, I can't believe those people are being so mean to me. Why can't they just do everything I say and love me? And so that's why it's bad logic. Now, continue our example to show how this would be used and why it can be very effective is this. As I mentioned, I picked the Green New Deal because it's like big in the news, and our president has come through for me again and presented a beautiful example of straw man and hyperbole. So what he said, and it's a famous tweet, he said the Green New Deal would do what? Get rid of all our cows, planes, cars, military, oil and gas permanently, even though no other country did the same. So his restored version was no more cows, no more planes, no, no more automobiles. We'll still have trains, I guess, and permanently get rid of all of that stuff. And so he attacks that, and then rejects the Green New Deal. So essentially saying the Green New Deal is terrible because they permanently get rid of our cars, planes, automobiles, military, oil, gas, everything. Permanently, no one else will do anything. And of course that is terrible. Therefore this is terrible. Now the problem is, of course, that's not this. So attacking that doesn't attack that. I mean, I would agree with Trump. If the plan was no more cows, no more planes, no more gas, no more oil, no more military, that would be a terrible plan. I can get around the car thing. We could all just like run to school. That'd be fine. They just need like showers or something, or we could all just be filthy all day. And so yeah, that would be a terrible idea, but it's not the real plan. Now the real plan does have real defects, and so one question comes up: why straw man or exaggerate something if everything has some defects you could criticize? I mean, for example, could we really achieve carbon neutrality in 10 years? And the answer is probably not, realistically. I mean, think about planes. We don't, the technology to make planes carbon neutral, they're not quite there yet. And it would be unrealistic to get rid of all planes because, our economy still depends on travel. And people like to go home. I like to go back to Maine, and it's a long way to run to get to Maine. So yeah, there are real defects in there. So why use this fallacy? Well, the reason is, of course, it works. So why does it work? Well, one reason is this. How many people here know all the details of the Green New Deal? If you do, raise your hand. Yeah, my hands are not going up. I don't know all the stuff in there. I know there's some stuff. It's green. It's new. It's a deal. But I don't know all the details. So one reason it works is, especially against complicated things, is that people generally don't know what's in there. I mean, think of like the Affordable Care Act. It's thousands upon thousands of pages. Anyone who says they've read it, it's like the person who said they read all of War and Peace and Moby Dick together. Someone's read it, probably, but most people don't. So one reason it works is people don't know what's, they often don't know what's there. So they don't know that this is not the case. So the defense there on the side of good is if it matters, like if you are concerned about the destruction of the earth and so forth, then you want to look and see what's really in there. So if someone says, yeah, this is a terrible plan, the defense is to say, wait, that's not the plan. It may still have defects, but that's not the plan. Second reason is that it can be effective because it ties into people's feelings in a way. So if you use tying into hyperbole, if someone, think about people who are like against climate, think climate change is not real, etc. This feels right, because if they hate the Democrats and the liberals and the snowflakes, this feels like something they would do. It matches the kind of conspiracy. So psychologically, this can be much more effective because it feels true. So another thing is the feels part, the rhetoric. Also, effectiveness. Now, as I mentioned before, if you're trying to convince people of something, not the worst thing you could do, but a terrible, terrible strategy is trying to use reason and logic, because people get super bored and they're going to tune out. So, in fairness to Trump, let's suppose Trump he actually has, he sat down with the Green New Deal and went through it, logically and said, did all the calculations and saw we couldn't hit the carbon goal and found all these, page after page of rational arguments. And he went to the American people and said, consider, if you will, the following graph, these formulas and equations, and you'll note that given the current economic structures, we cannot achieve carbon neutrality within 10 years for the following factors: C subchart A, subchart B, subchart G. And he went through with that in great detail. Would that win over the people? No, that would bore the people, which is why you don't see commercials, you don't have someone laying out logical, detailed arguments, because people hate that. what people generally like is something dramatic, something simple, dramatic, and emotionally appealing. So weirdly enough, and this becomes kind of a moral problem, if you are right about something being, say, terrible, and you wanted to argue against it, if you used a good argument, it probably wouldn't work. Because people would just be sitting there going, boring, and they would turn to something else. So one reason to use this is it is effective because it's catchy, effective, it's catchy, it's short, and it impacts people. Whereas the arguments are just for people. So even if the new Green Deal was terrible, if you were trying to persuade people, if you put together like a 5-hour YouTube video, no one's going to watch that. But if you can boil it down to a nice straw man, catchy, single tweet, it's more effective than all arguments, graphs, and charts. Which does raise a moral problem. Suppose you are right about something being terrible, should you do this to convince people? Well, morally you might say, yeah. To use an analogy, imagine you got a friend, and your friend is going to try this wacky diet. It's not going to kill them, but it's a bad diet. It's going to be unhealthy. And if you lay out all the nutritional facts, they're going to be, imagine your friend is bored by facts and immune to logic. You're like, it's never going to work. Instead, you tell them, well, if you do this, your hair will fall out. And they've got like really good hair. And you're like, crap, I can't do that. Well, on one hand, you distorted it because it's not really going to do that. But on the other hand, you saved your friend from a terrible diet. So it's kind of an interesting moral problem. If reason doesn't work and you're right, is it more than okay to straw man someone to get them to do something good? Tough moral problem. But getting back to the fallacy itself, it's always a fallacy. So to use the fallacy is always bad logic. So again, the defense against it is tough because one, you've got to kind of know what's real, so you've got to do your homework, and then you kind of got to stick to that real version. Now, using it is super easy. One reason to use it, again, is it's easy. You don't have to read this. You just make something up about it. It's very effective, and so, very useful tool. So what you do is you take the position, view, policy, etc., and then craft a distorted, monstrous version. Now, the more you know your audience, the more you know what they hate, or fear, or dislike, the better you can craft this. And it becomes very effective for the reasons I gave. People don't do their homework, people are swayed by emotion, people are bored by logic and reasons. And most of our political debate today, even people wonder, like, why do we have so many problems? Well, because this is our political debates today. We don't argue about the facts and reality, it's just straw man. Like, when they say, the Democrats just want open borders, let anybody in. So if you say, well, maybe we should have a wall, oh, you just want open borders. Straw man. And of course, people on the left do it as well. And so that's kind of a problem. So that's the classic straw man. Now, one variation of it involves reference to the unknown fact. And what people will do is they'll often straw man someone's position by claiming to know some secret thing about the opposition that makes them terrible. For example, think about the debate about climate change. What a critic of, someone who thinks climate change is real, a critic might say, oh, those liberals, they hate capitalism and they want to destroy it. And their whole position really is not to have renewable energy, but to destroy capitalism. And then if you say, well, where's the evidence? And they don't have it, because it's an unknown fact. And people on the left do this as well. They might say, oh, the Republicans, they favor, they're against gun control because they don't love children. They don't love their children. They'd rather everybody die than get rid of their gun money. And you'd say, well, where's the evidence? Well, there isn't. It's a claimed insight that's unfounded in fact. But it does work, again, because people think terrible things about people they disagree with, and so it can be quite effective. So in recap, in terms of using this, the side of evil, really effective. So if you straw man something, you have a good chance of pulling the people on your side and winning, so to speak. Okay, before moving away from straw man, anything about straw or man that needs more stuff? false dilemma. Now, the false dilemma gets its power, its bite, from the fact that it does have a connection to good logic. There's something called a real dilemma that is a valid deductive argument. And the simplest form of it is this. And as we'll see in the future, this is a valid argument, because if this is true, and this is true, this has got to be true. So, for example, think of the upcoming election. Either a Democrat will win or a Republican. And suppose, for some reason, someone says, well, the Democrat didn't win. Well, you know the Republican won, because those are the only viable options. And that would be good logic in that case. So then, why is the false dilemma a fallacy if dilemmas are good logic? Well, here's why. The false dilemma occurs when someone presents two options as if they're the only two, but it's a false dilemma because there's more than two. There's 3, 4, 5, or 6 more options. And that shows the bad logic. Because if you have this, P or Q, not PQ, good logic. If you have P or Q or R, not P, you can't conclude Q. You could conclude Q or R, that'd be fine. But to conclude Q would be logically, would be an invalid argument. So the way a false dilemma is done is, again, presenting two options if they're the only choice, and there's really a third, fourth, fifth, sixth choice. And so that's the trap. For example, our good dead friend Socrates actually seems to have committed a false dilemma in the Platonic dialogue, the Apology. So our friend Socrates is on trial for corrupting the youth, believing in foreign gods, etc. And he's been sentenced to death, and his friends, of course, are all sad and worried because their friend Socrates is going to be put to death. And he's trying to convince his friends that death is nothing to fear. So he says to them, friends, there are two possibilities. One is, when I die, that's it. It is done. And I have nothing to fear because I won't be, so I can't suffer anymore. Death is the end of all things. Nothing to be afraid of. It's like a dreamless sleep that lasts for an eternity. Nothing to be worried about. Or the other option is, it's going to what we call today heaven. Going to a good place with good people, being able to hang out with good people forever in a great place, a good place. And that, of course, is nothing to fear. Therefore, death is nothing to fear. Now, it's a false dilemma because, well, are those the only two options? Well, in most religions, like Christianity, Islam, etc., you get to heaven, but you also get hell. And is hell fun? Hell is not fun. Because it's got like fire and scorpions, and it's got television, but it's always stuck on probably CNN, I guess, forever, like airports. No coincidence there. And so, yeah, Socrates presents a false dilemma. Now, he's probably just trying to make his friends feel better, because he should know better being Socrates, but it is a false dilemma. Another example from philosophy is from our good dead friend Blaise Pascal, which sounds like an action hero or porn star, possibly both. And Blaise was a French guy known for developing probability theory, gambling, and he used his, really, back in, weird story. We get all our probability theory, it traces back to the French nobles who spent a lot of time gambling, card games, dice games, etc., and they wanted to know all the probability and odds, so they hired mathematicians to work out probability theory. So that's where, it comes out of gambling. Yeah, many of our theories and sciences and stuff have fairly seedy, corrupt origins, which is, pretty funny, but not surprising. And Pascal came up with this famous Pascal's wager. And he said, we have no way of knowing if God exists or not, because it's beyond our ability to know. But he says, we have two options. God exists, or God does not. Now in this case, it's it seems like a really good dilemma, because it's P or not P. You only have two choices. And he says, well, we gotta pick one. The best choice, he claims, is, he says, well, he basically argues this. If you bet for God and you're wrong, lose nothing. You just don't, you spend some time in church. If you bet against God and you're wrong, you get hell forever. If you bet for God and you're right, heaven forever. So you have this dilemma, God or no God. God is the big, believing for God gets you the best reward, so believe in God. Now, critics have said, this is a false dilemma, because, yeah, it's true there's God or not God, but think of every other religion that we know about. You have to throw in every possible god: Zeus, Apollo, Quetzalcoatl, Tolek, Tiamat, Bahamut, Beelzebul, Asmodeus, all those, and ones we haven't even thought of yet. All kinds of other possible religions. Potentially an infinite number of gods. In that case, yeah, one of them might be right, but we don't know which one. And so as critics have said, that's a false dilemma. Now, this can also be done, obviously, in normal life. People are presented with false dilemmas. For example, someone might be talking about prayer in public schools, and someone might say, we're both for prayer in public schools, aren't we? And someone might say, no, I'm not. What? Are you an atheist? Because the idea would be you're either for prayer in school or you're an atheist. But those aren't the only options. You could not be for prayer in school, but not be an atheist. You may think that there should be separation of church and state, or you may be the member of minority religion, and if there's prayer in school, it's not going to be like everybody's prayer. It's going to be, a certain person's prayer. They're not going to have Buddhist prayers or prayers to Quetzalcoatl in the schools. And so that would be kind of a more standard false dilemma. So on the side of evil, how would you use this? Well, here's how it's done. You present someone with two choices, and you want to make one of the choices clearly unappealing, clearly bad. Because otherwise they might pick the other one. I say, I'll take that. So you present two choices. If there are only two, one of them is like bad or awful, like accusing someone of being an atheist, for example. But again, there's a risk. The person might just say, yes, I am. I'm a total atheist. And so you present them to people, this one being awful, in the hopes they'll take this one. And it's quite effective, because if you can convince someone they only have two choices, and this one's terrible, they're going to go for this one. But again, the mistake is that it's a trap. They really have other choices. Now, in many cases, going back to our straw man friend, it's often combined with straw man, because you can present a distorted, exaggerated position. So, for example, someone might say, well, you've got two choices. You can go with deregulation of the environment, or you can have this Green New Deal where they get rid of all the cows, the planes, the military, oil and gas forever. Those are your choices. Getting rid of everything or total deregulation. But of course that's a straw man, because the real position is not get rid of planes, cars, etc. So it's a false dilemma with a straw man stuck in there, which is a common tactic, because if you want to make something look bad, a good way to do it is a straw man. So on the side of evil, give someone like yucky choice A, choice B, and say, hey, do you want the yucky thing or do you want the non-yucky thing? And they're going to go for this. The defense against it on the side of good is to say those are not my only options. So if it's, total deregulation or a Green Deal, those aren't your only choices. There's a lot in between. Now, there are cases, of course, that are real dilemmas, where there really are only two choices. For example, in the upcoming election, yeah, there'll be surprising number of people on the presidential ballot, depending on which state you're in. You may have various options, but in reality, what's the reality of American politics? Will we have a Green Party president in 2020? No. So, yeah, that's a real dilemma. You're either going to get the Democrat or the Republican. So in that case, you can vote for other people, but those are currently only viable options at the presidential level. Or like true-false questions. Unless the question is like defective, it's got to be true or false. So in a case where there really are only two options, not a dilemma. So if someone says, it's true or false, clearly not true, so it's got to be false. That's fine. So in terms of deploying on the side of evil, again, you want to get somebody to accept something, but you want to stack the deck. So give them one choice, even though there's many, and make that look bad. Now, of course, one thing that you have to keep in mind is if you make it look too bad, people might start getting suspicious. But going back to straw man, people have an amazing tolerance for absurdity. Things that if you looked at it rationally, you think there's no way that could be the person's real position. But if people are really motivated by hate or fear, they'll accept that. For example, when Obamacare was going through, they put forth the notion that Obamacare included death panels, that they were going to kill like people's grandparents. And rational people were like, no one's suggesting that. Because what they actually had was end of life counseling. So that way, basically if someone's at the end of life, they can get hospice, decide how they're going to, the exact opposite of death. It's not, we're going to kill you, it's that we're going to make your dying not horrible. But it got out as death panels. And people, believed it, even though that's insane. Likewise, if you think about it, no mainstream politician is going to propose getting rid of all cows, planes, etc. I mean, there's probably someone who would, but not mainstream. So, but people say, hey, that can be true. So the limits of absurdity are pretty big. So know your audience. Know how much absurdity they can eat. Before pressing on, anything about the false dilemma that needs any more stuff? Perfectionist fallacy. This one is a version, a subcategory of the false dilemma. So these two are still false dilemmas, but like with any of the fallacies that have like subcategories, if you're doing the quiz, exam, etc., when I wrote the questions that I wrote, I don't put these together because you'd be like, there's a couple hard answers. But I did pull, there's some from the actual publisher's testing banks, and as I recall, they did have some that were kind of like pick the best answer. So if you see something that's like clearly perfectionist, but they also have false dilemma, and it's not, pick multiple answers, always go with a more particular one, because that would be righter. Which is why on things like the SAT and LSAT, they don't say pick a correct answer, they say pick the best answer. And one evil thing they do is you could have 5 answers that are correct, but one of them is correctest, and that's one you have to go with. So perfectionist fallacy is this. In its most blatant form, essentially it's perfect or nothing. You gotta reject it. And of course nothing's perfect, so gotta reject it. Now, as you might imagine, most fallacies, if you just sort of presented them to people, stripped down to the actual structure, pretty much almost no one would fall for it. Like with a straw man, if someone said, allow me to present a distorted version of my opponent's position that is nothing like it, therefore reject it, people would say, hey, I'm not going to do that. So you never want to show like the trick. Just like with, if someone's doing, creating counterfeit art, they're not going to say, hey, look at the Mona Lisa I painted, hey, you want to buy this genuine Mona Lisa? They're not going to say that. They're going to present it as the real Mona Lisa. So with this, what a person does is, they're not going to say, oh, it's going to be absolutely perfect, or we're going to reject it. Nothing can be perfect, so reject it. Because that would involve rejecting everything. You could accept nothing. So what they'll do is they'll put in unreasonable standards, or difficult to meet standards, that can't or probably can't be reached, and then get someone to say, well, if we can't have this level, we've got to reject it. Now this is a fallacy when this standard is too high. It's setting setting a condition that could not be met. And the reason I call it perfectionist fallacy is because, you know, essentially the idea is you're setting the standard so high that it might as well have to be perfect. And so you could reject everything, you know, because nothing's perfect. So it's most commonly used when someone wants you to reject something, but they don't have a good reason, you know, or they're just being kind of lazy to reject it, to give good reasons to reject it. So what would be an example? Well, one was when they've been discussing for years in baseball about getting, you know, the camera, you know, for replays. Like they do, you know, in football, they have the camera replay. They still screw it up, but they have the camera replay. Because the idea being that, well, that if you have cameras, then better chance of good, you know, humping in the case of baseball. Now, people have argued that no matter how many cameras you have, they're still going to miss something. There's going to be like someone's in the way, so you just see their back. You don't know did they step, you know, stomp on the person, or was the, you know, or it may miss like where the ball lands exactly. Was it, you know, so close to the line or your camera angle? And they might say, well, we're never going to get everything, so we shouldn't use this, because they're not going to be able to get everything. And of course, it may seem kind of reasonable. You know, someone might say, yeah, that's right. You know, there'll be many cases where one player is blocking it, or we don't have a camera, just don't happen to have a camera there. So yeah, so why bother? Of course, the problem is, do we actually need cameras to capture everything? No, because you could say, well, yeah, it's not going to be perfect, but it's better than relying on the umpires, because they're only a limited place, and they're just relying on their own eyesight, so they clearly can't see everything. It's also occasionally done with, often done with plans and proposals. So someone might say, you know, like, this tax cut won't solve all our economic woes, so we shouldn't do it. And of course, nothing's going to solve all our economic woes, and so if we use that logic, we should never do anything at all. Now, psychologically, it's effective because people often, you know, want to reject things. You know, they weigh things negatively, so it's very useful. So the side of evil, what you do is if you don't want to reject something or don't want to do something, just say basically this, and then you want to gauge like what level would be, you know, not possible, but not absurd. So if someone just, you know, screams out, you know, this will not do it to perfection, to absolute perfection, people would say, whoa, you know, that's crazy. So you want to kind of gauge it. What would your audience accept as, yeah, you can't reach that, but not look so obvious that you're stacking the deck? And in some cases, it can be pretty ridiculous, you know, in terms of what's expected. Again, when people are talking about using the cameras, people are saying, well, it won't catch every shot. And some people are like, yeah, duh, it's not perfect. What fool would expect that? And the person's like, I totally expect that, so there's always a fool. But you want to kind of gauge it. And it can be quite effective, because psychologically, again, people weigh the negative much heavier, and people tend to want to reject stuff. They want to, you know, just not accept it. Just change is scary. On the side of good, the defense is to ask, is this a reasonable standard? Now, this can become a matter of considerable debate, because what counts as like a reasonable expectation can vary quite a bit between people. And so you can have areas that are, you know, clearly this fallacy, and others where you'd have a debate about, does it have to be that good? But the idea is that objectively the fallacy occurs when the standard is too high. The person is intentionally trying to get people to reject things by intentionally putting a standard that's too high. And their whole point is to try to fool people to think this is actually reasonable. And there can be cases where it may look like a perfectionist fallacy, but it's not, because the person is not trying to reject it on impossible standards. They may just be expecting higher standards that one might disagree with. Now, there are cases where you have legitimate real standards. And again, that can be a matter of debate. So in this case, it becomes a matter of what is a person trying to do? So if we're discussing, like, suppose we're discussing, you know, we've got a new startup, and we've got web-based, like everything is, and we're looking at different companies providing service. And we look at Amazon, and they say they'll provide 99% uptime. And we look at another company, like a small local company, and they say they give 95% uptime. And you say, well, Amazon's a big, soulless, company, and this little local business is, really nice, but they only give 95% uptime. So we'll go with Amazon. Now in that case, is that a perfectionist fallacy? Well, it depends on the person's intent. If the person is trying to set up a unreasonable high standard, so this could be a matter of debate. But could that be a reasonable standard? If you're running a business, you need your web presence out there, could that difference of 4 percentage points, could that translate into 4% of your business? Yeah, that could make an important difference. You could have, laying aside a case of like a super important client going and finding your website down. This will mean that, 4 percentage points more, people go to your site to buy your stuff, and your site's not there. So this would lower your revenue potentially 4 percentage points. And so that would not be reasonable. So you can have cases where you may have very high standards, but if they are legitimate, and the person is not trying to reject it by putting forth something, impossible, then it need not be this fallacy. But again, there can be debate about, is that a reasonable standard? So in practical matters, it can be hard to sort out, is the person trying to, perfectionist fallacy me, or are they legitimately got standards they really, really believe in? Now, on the quizzes, assignments, etc., the examples will tend to be more paradigm. In other words, they'll be sort of clear about what they're doing. In real life, of course, it's much muckier, but I wouldn't use an example like this, because it'd be, well, maybe they're straw manning, maybe they're not. There'll be clear examples of either they are or they're not. Before moving away from perfectionist, anything about it that needs more per or perfection? Line drawing fallacy. This one's an old one that's, for centuries, had been kind of a intellectual abstract fallacy. And then the Rodney King trial made it a real world fallacy. And here's the basic fallacy. It's a false dilemma because the person says, we have to be able to draw a definite line between two things. It's either this or that. And if we can't, then there's no difference. We can't draw the line, so there's no, not D, so there's no difference. Now, for years, examples involve things like, reasoning like this. If you pluck a single hair from someone's head, are they now bald? No. Suppose if they pluck a second one, are they now bald? Now, can you draw a line and specify the exact number of hairs that a person must have pulled from their head before they can become bald?
Here.
Yeah, in theory, I guess you could. But baldness is kind of a vague notion, because you have people who are like Telly Savalas or Mr. Clean Bald, who have no zero hair. Then you have like Patrick Stewart, who's like, we say he's bald, but he still has some on the sides. Yeah, and so if someone was, if you kept pulling hair, what's the exact point they'd be bald? Well, we can't specify. Therefore, you can never make someone bald by pulling their hair. But that's clearly absurd, because eventually you're going to have zero hair, so that would occur. And again, that's a pretty abstract, theoretical thing, because you wouldn't say, gosh, what a serious problem that is. We don't know if baldness occurs. Yeah, and so when I was in school, those are kind of the examples. Another one was like with money. If you give someone $1, are they rich? Give them another $1, are they rich? And you can't specify the exact dollar where someone goes from being not rich to rich. Therefore, you can never give someone enough money to make them rich, which is clearly absurd, because eventually we be able to say exactly which dollar makes you rich, but eventually you keep pounding the dollars, we'll say they're rich. So when did this become a real thing? Well, the answer is with Rodney King. And that, of course, is the famous case where he was beaten by the LAPD, and was caught on tape. This is back before cell phones. Now cell phones are everywhere. This is back when cameras were big. So it was just, in a way, it was just kind of pure chance that it was captured. Because if you ever seen, like, you know, films from that time period, cameras were motion picture cameras were pretty good size. You wouldn't just be lugging one around. Now, this is what actually occurred in the trial, the first one. The jury said that they couldn't specify the exact blow, where it went from legitimate use of force to not. Because they said they claimed everyone agreed that the initial use of force was acceptable. Not true, but that's what they claimed. But they say you couldn't say, okay, you know, swing, okay, suddenly after like eight is enough, and then the ninth one is suddenly, you know, excessive force. And they said there is no way to draw a line between legitimate and excess force. Since this line was never, they couldn't specify the exact line, it couldn't have been crossed. Therefore, the beating never became excessive force. And that was actually used in the trial. And on the one side, clearly horrible. On the other side, there's an example of someone using the line drawing fallacy in a real, you know, serious case. Now, logically, of course, that's the fallacy, because is it true that we probably couldn't tell the police, okay, you can hit someone 8 times, but 9 is too much? No, because if they're arresting, you know, someone like a 90-year-old person and they won, could be too much. But if someone who's, you know, they're trying to arrest Arnold Schwarzenegger in his prime, they might need like 40 or 50. You know, so you can't just say, okay, you get 4 swings, and then you gotta stop, because 4 may be too much, or 4 may be too many, and so we can't specify how much, you know, is acceptable exactly. But can we still say that? Excuse me.
Bless you.
Thank you. Can we still say that we can recognize excess when we see it? Yeah, because there's gray areas. You might say, yeah, you know, I can't say exactly in the course of this beating, where people may disagree. Someone might say, yeah, that 9 swing, way too much. And someone might say, no, you know, it was the 13th, that was too much. But if they go, you know, at a certain point, it keeps on going, you're like, yeah, maybe we're not sure of this. But when you say, yeah, that 20th hit, yeah, that was definitely too much. So we may disagree. This may be kind of a gray area. But yeah, we can say, yeah, it's definitely happened. Kind of like with baldness. We may disagree. If someone has a receding hairline, someone may say, yeah, they're bald. Someone else may say, not sure. But if someone doesn't have any hair, you can say definitely bald. Now on the side of evil, the line drawing fallacy works when essentially you want to say, if we can't specify an exact point, then we can't specify anything. We can't have any standard. And now, one version of this is like with definitions of things. So someone might say, they might try to use kind of a variation of this to try to say that something, you can't say convict people of something. So during the Kavanaugh hearings, people are bringing up like what counts as assault. And people do point out gray areas. Like what if the person didn't give explicit verbal consent, but didn't say no and was going along, you know, seemingly going along? Is that assault? Or what if the person, you know, doesn't give verbal consent, doesn't seem really into it, but doesn't say no? Is that assault? And yeah, so there's gray areas. But if someone says, well, we have these gray areas, so we can never define assault, that would be this, you know, example of this fallacy. Because sure, there'll be gray areas for anything where you can have a legitimate dispute, but then will be clear areas you'll say, yeah, if someone like attacks somebody, yeah, that's clearly not great. And so, yeah, you can still have gray zones, you can't exactly specify it, but then you can have cases where it clearly is. Now, as a practical matter, this can be a legitimate real problem in the sense of when we're crafting laws, we have to kind of like specify, you just can't say, well, all of you do, yeah, you'll kind of know when you see it, you kind of have to have a decent definition. So there is the practical problem of where do we say that the line is crossed? But if someone says, well, we can't exactly specify that, so free license to assault people, well, no, because we can say there are cases where we clearly recognize that. As you might imagine, vague terms, things like rich, bald, etc., they can be used quite effectively when trying to do this, because if you use a vague term like bald, rich, or poor, then it's by its very nature fuzzy. Okay, so on the side of evil, what you want to do is you want to reject something by saying there's no clear line. So for example, someone might say, well, you really can't define this as assault because there's no clear line, so we can't have any standard. We can't say this person is guilty of this. The defense is saying, well, even if we can't define an exact line, there's still like a clear kind of crossover. We might say, yeah, this is fuzzy, but that doesn't mean these other cases are not clear. So we may say, yeah, in these cases, it might come down to a decision of a jury or a judge, or maybe we can't convict in those cases, but when we get here, yeah, clearly the case. So the fact that this is fuzzy doesn't mean that this is therefore fuzzy. Before pressing on, anything about line drawing that needs more line or drawing? The slippery slope. Now this is a key toolkit item for, as you might imagine, political debates, debates over hot button issues, and it gets its power from two things: psychology, and also kind of a legitimate version of this. And what becomes a problem is that people tend to smush legitimate version in with the fallacy, and then it gets its power from it. Again, it's kind of like a counterfeit, counterfeit money. So first, the slippery slope, and then where it gets its power from. There's actually two variations of this. The first one, this sort of the slippery slope classic, is the idea that if we do or allow or accept one thing, that inevitably something else, typically something terrible, must follow. Now, the fallacy is not saying that something must follow from something else. The fallacy is when someone says, if we do A, therefore we'll automatically get B. Usually something awful, because it's typically done to get people to reject A. Although you could have a positive one where someone says, if we do this, then we'll get this great thing. So where the fallacy lies is, no reasons are given why it must be, why it must occur. Person base says, if we do this, then this terrible thing will happen, but they're missing the pieces that connect A to B. Now, it's a common tactic in, as you might imagine, politics and moral debates. For example, back in the old days when same-sex marriage was a big political issue, there were a lot of slippery slope arguments against it. One person famously made the argument that if you allow same-sex marriage, then people will be allowed to marry goats and turtles. And of course that's because the idea is turtle marriage and goat marriage would be terrible. And so the idea would be if you allow this, then people will be marrying goats and turtles. But of course, that's a slippery slope. Allow same-sex marriage, goat marriage is next. Well, no, you don't have to go from one to another. You don't have to say, oh, well, you got same-sex marriage, now we've got to issue licenses to goats. Doesn't follow at all. Or another example, like if we allow some deregulation, then the next thing, people will be dumping toxic waste everywhere in Yosemite, National Park. And of course that doesn't follow either. So if we allow say some drilling in some parks, it doesn't follow that next thing you know, they'll be just destroying all parks. It's a big, big leap. Now, again, the reason why it's a fallacy is because there's no, they don't make the link. They say, if we do this, something terrible happens, but they give no reasons why this is gotta happen. Now, psychologically, though, it can be very effective. Why? Well, first, again, that emotional force. The thing presented as occurring is typically something people hate or fear or see as bad. And so what happens is people get moved by it, not because the connection's been drawn, but because they really hate this or fear this or dislike it. So they just say, well, this has got to be true because I hate that, which is terrible logic. So if someone says, you know, if we allow same-sex marriage, the next thing that, you know, goat marriage will be allowed, that's crazy, and so this is terrible. Well, the question to ask is, on the defensive side, but will this actually lead to that? Or going back to the example of allowing drilling in public, in public lands, if someone says, well, if we allow them to have limited oil exploration in Alaska, the next thing you know, there'll be an oil well in Old Faithful. Well, yeah, that would be terrible, but is that going to happen? Is there any reasons given? So if the answer is no, it would be this fallacy. And again, it gets its power because people fear or hate this, so they just their brain sort of fills in the gap, not with any steps, but they just feel the fear or anger, so they just say, oh yeah, I'm scared of that, it's got to follow. It especially works when people don't like this, but really don't have a good reason. So they just kind of, make something up. Now on the side of good, the question you get to ask is, where's the connection? On the side of evil, the way to do it is this. You have something you want people to reject, but either you don't have any good reasons, or once again, you know that people don't like logic, they don't like reasons. So for example, suppose you were opposed to same-sex marriage, and you had a series of carefully laid out arguments. Those are going to bore people. So instead of going through all these careful arguments, this would be much more effective. Similarly, if you were opposed to this deregulation, and you had all kinds of really good arguments and charts and graphs, that's going to bore people. So you're better off just saying, they're going to be putting a oil well in Old Faithful, because that's much more effective, because people feel that. So it raises kind of a similar problem. If you're right, but no one's going to believe you because people don't like logic, should you just use this? Which is a moral question. But of course, even if you're right, that would still be a fallacy to not give the reasons. Now, if you can connect the dots, then it wouldn't be a fallacy. So even if the connection may be not that great, but if you do make a connection, it could be a bad argument, but not a fallacy. For example, if someone says we should not allow oil drilling in the Alaska national parks, because if you allow it there, the obvious next step would be once you go from exploration drilling, you get to drill. And then that sets the legal precedent that if they can say, well, we're allowed to drill in Alaska, why not Florida? And then if we allow it in Florida, this could go through all 50 states, and over the course of several years, we could very well have oil wells in Yosemite. Now that may not be true, but it's not bad logic, because these steps are being laid out. So if someone lays out the steps, connecting them wouldn't be the fallacy. And again, people use this because it's effective and simple. You don't have to argue, and it works well in the audience, because you're hitting their emotions and not reason. Now, you may hear in the media, popular press, people using the slippery slope argument, and one problem is that in the popular media, they don't generally distinguish between slippery slope fallacy and slippery slope argument. A good slippery slope argument is that something will follow from doing this, and reasons are given. That would be a good slippery slope argument. But I hate using the term slippery slope because it generally refers to the fallacy. So if you hear people talking about the slippery slope, you have to be careful. Are they talking about the fallacy, or are they giving, you know, the good version in which they actually put in the steps? Second version. Sometimes called the Vietnam fallacy. And the reason why is this. When you get into Vietnam, one of the reasons people gave as to why we should stay there is because we were already there. We were in it, like we had, say, 50,000 troops, so the argument was, well, we're there, we have 50,000 troops, why not keep putting in more troops? So the reasoning is, we're already on this course, therefore we should stay on that course because it's a good one. Now the problem with that is, just because we're doing it, it doesn't follow that it's a good idea. I mean, in fact, we have sayings that provide psychological power for this, namely like, don't change horses midstream. But if your horse is, you know, running for the waterfall and it's going to jump off, you have like murder horse, then you want to get off that horse because it's gonna kill you. So, yeah, that's, you know, the fact that we've been doing something doesn't mean it's a good idea. And now people fall for this because, you know, it's what's called in economics the sunk cost fallacy. The idea is because you've already put, you know, money into it or time, they need to stick with it, and therefore it's a good idea. Now that doesn't follow, because if you've been wasting money on something and you keep throwing more money into it, it'd be like, well, I already threw, you know, $1,000 into this fire, I might as well just keep throwing all my money. That would clearly be stupid. One example of this, years ago, back in the ancient days when I first started teaching here, we had a system called SAS. It was an advising system. Anybody ever use it? No, not every day, because it never worked. You could never get it to work. I remember I was at one of the meetings, and we're like, this thing doesn't work. And they're like, you got to use it. Like, it doesn't work. And they said, well, we've already put, you know, $1 million into it. We're going to keep pouring money into it. It's like, that's the Vietnam fallacy. You know, we put all this money into it. It's not working. Putting more money into it would be a terrible idea. Saying we've already burned $1 million on it. Why not burn more? That's terrible. Now, people often use this for a couple reasons. One is, if they stand to profit, they want people to keep putting in the money. So someone who's like a scam artist or misleading someone or, you know, committing fraud, they would want to keep saying, oh, you're in this much, you got to keep on going. Also, people don't like to be wrong. So if you have people who've been, you know, it's kind of their job and their career. So the people, like, say, selling this computer system, they might have a motivation because they want you to keep pouring money into it, even though it's not working. And someone who's, you know, backed it, they have a lot of, you know, pride in it, because if they give up, they're saying they're wrong, and that's hard to do. So people often do this to avoid admitting they're wrong, that they're not going to be wrong, and they're going to prove that by being even wronger. Now, the defense against it is to say, okay, we've done this, but is it worth doing this? Are we on the right course? It'd be like if someone was driving and they're lost, and they say, I'm going to keep driving this way. You know, suppose they start driving, they're heading north, and they say, we're going to get to Miami driving north from Tallahassee. It's like, no matter how far you go north from Tallahassee, you're not going to get to Miami. Unless your car is, you know, a boat or a plane, it's not going to, you know, make it there. So the defense is say, we've done this, but is this a good idea? Should we keep doing this? Now, there are cases that may seem to be this, but are not. Specifically, if you've invested in something and achieving the goal would be a good idea or worthwhile, then it would be a bad idea to stop. For example, I've had people, students, who literally were one class short of graduating, and they're like, well, I don't want to finish up this class. And what the argument I always give is, well, if you don't finish, all of those credits amount to nothing. You've got nothing. You go in and you say, I did some college. They say, what's your degree? I haven't got one. So you might as well have done nothing. But if they finish that last course, they now have a college degree, which makes a huge difference. And it's kind of weird. It's like that 3 credits, you know, even though you think logically there's no difference. Okay, I've got 117 hours versus 120, But it's kind of like finishing a marathon. If someone's, racing the marathon, they stop 2 feet before the finish line, they don't win. They don't finish. They get nothing. So if someone is been on the course and it makes sense to continue, that would be the fallacy. So when I said to a student, look, you're 3 credit hours short, just take this class, just get this class done, you get the degree, that will increase your chance of getting a job dramatically, increase your income dramatically, and you wouldn't have just thrown away all this money. And that wouldn't be slippery slope. That would be, you're just about to the finish line, you get nothing unless you cross it, you want something, so cross it. So not slippery slope. Last 2 fallacies, or 3 actually, because 2 come together. The burden of proof, or misplace the burden of proof. Now in the logic stuff, there's this notion of burden of proof. And the idea is this: if you got the burden of proof, then you have to do the proving. So if one side has the burden of proof, the other side is considered right unless the other side can prove them wrong. And as you might imagine, having the burden of proof on someone else is great, because you're right until proven wrong. They have to do the work. So one tactic is to push the burden of proof onto someone else, because again, they've got to do all the work. You're right until they prove you wrong, and then you get a chance to prove them wrong. So you always want to try to stick the burden of proof on someone else. But logically, there's the question of who should actually get it. Now this is a matter of great debate, but there are essentially 3 standards. One is initial plausibility. So for example, if I claim that I have psychic powers, then I should prove that, because that psychic powers are wildly implausible. If I claim that I ran a 5K, well, that's not too implausible. So that's kind of believable. Now, there's considerable debate, of course, about which side is more plausible. So, for example, suppose somebody says cutting taxes improves the economy, and they say, you should prove me wrong because I've got initial plausibility. But to someone else, it won't be plausible. So you can have a serious battle about which one is more plausible. But objectively speaking, whichever one has got the most plausibility, that's the side that doesn't get the burden. But then the fight would be who's got the plausibility. Now, from a practical standpoint, if there's a legitimate battle between them, there is a real question, then the fair thing to do is say, well, no one gets the burden. We start off on equal footing. We start off at 0. Next, affirmative versus negative. In general, with some notable exceptions, we expect there to be reasons why something is the case or why we should change something, and the default is for the status quo, that things should be as they are. So for example, if someone proposed radically changing the gen ed system, instead of just saying, I want to radically change the gen ed system, prove to me I'm wrong, well no, you say to them, tell us why we should change that. Special circumstances. Now this can involve a lot of value judgments. For example, in the US, in theory, people are innocent until proven guilty. So the burden of proof is on the prosecution, at least in theory. Now in some places, like the former Soviet Union, the burden of proof is on the defense, because it was assumed the state would not bring an innocent person to trial. So it was up to the lawyer of the accused to prove the state wrong. And the lawyer was also paid by the state. So you might imagine the old Soviet Union had a pretty good conviction rate. But this is a philosophical debate. Namely, in the US, at least in theory, the idea is that it's better that the guilty go free than the innocent be punished, at least in theory. Whereas the other view is it's better that the innocent be punished than the guilty go free. So depending on your philosophical and moral view, the burden of proof gets placed based on that. And so this can be a matter of value in terms of the ethics. Now, in terms of the side of evil, the way to use this is this. Stick the burden of proof on your opponent. Basically say, you say your thing and say, prove that I'm wrong. And make them do the work. And if they fall for it, well, they have to do the work. The defense, if someone tries to stick it onto you, from a logical standpoint, is to bring up these points. Namely, why should I do the proving? Now, in general, the fair thing to do, unless both parties can agree who gets it, sometimes people do, is to start off again at 0. Both sides have to do the proving. One variation of this is what's called the appeal to ignorance, or ad ignorantium. And here's the form. What a person says is, you can't prove I am wrong, therefore I'm right. And it's typically done like in weird cases. Psychics, UFOs, Bigfoot, etc. So if someone says, you can't prove there aren't UFOs, so there are. Now, of course, that's misplacing the burden of proof, because what they're essentially saying is, you don't know there's not, so there is. Which is bad logic, because to illustrate, I'll use a story from elementary school. When I was in elementary school, I remember one of the kids, one of the clever kids said, I've got an invisible unicorn. And this is like first grade, we're like, unicorn, unicorn, unicorn. They're like, where is it? And the person's like, it's invisible. And then of course another smart kid is trying to like grab it, and he's saying, oh, he's too quick, you can never catch him. And then someone else, another smart kid said, I don't hear anything. Oh, he's also silent. And so people were trying to think of all kinds of ways to find the invisible unicorn, but of course everything that you'd say, like I don't smell a unicorn, when you go in the classroom, like where is he standing? There's no room. And they'd always, he's on the ceiling, and they'd always have some answer. And of course if that worked, if you couldn't disprove the invisible unicorn, therefore there must be invisible unicorns. But clearly there are not. So the burden of proof is on the invisible unicorn person to show there is. Same with UFOs and psychic powers. So if someone says, you can't prove people don't have psychic powers, well, that's probably true, because you have to test every person forever. But the burden of proof is not on the skeptic, it's on the person who says they exist. If they can bring someone who's got, psychic powers, then yeah, prove it. But if you can't, if you say you can't test everybody and show that no one's got them, well, that's true, because you just don't have the time, but it doesn't prove it. Our last fallacy, ending this chapter, is begging the question, also known as circular reasoning. Now, one unfortunate thing is, for some reason, people started using the term begging the question to mean asking the question. They say something like, this begs the question, why do this? I'm like, no, it doesn't beg the question, it asks the question. Because we have a perfectly good term for asking the question, which is ask the question. Even Stephen Colbert does this, and really made me mad. But still doesn't respond to my tweets, though. Now, begging the question as a fallacy is this, is when someone assumes is true what must be proven. And that's why it's also better known as circular reasoning. Someone is reasoning in a circle. So, for example, if someone says, I'm right. Why are you right? I'm right because I'm right, which is clearly assumes what needs to be proven. Now, the reason why it's bad logic is because you can't prove something is true by just assuming it's true. To give an example, there are many good arguments for God's existence, but here's a terrible one. Suppose someone says, I got proof of God's existence, and someone says, great, what is it? Well, the Bible says God exists. Okay, but what's the proof? Well, you can believe the Bible because God wrote it. Therefore, it's true. But of course, the problem there is, if you're proving that God exists with the Bible by saying that God wrote the Bible, you're saying God exists because God exists, which of course begs the question. Again, there are good arguments for God, but that is not one of them. It's a terrible one. So, begging the question, and it's commonly used, because sometimes it can be fairly subtle and people will fall for it. For example, debates about stuff being illegal. When they say illegal immigration is illegal, so it should show it's a crime, so it should always be a crime. It's like, yeah, it's illegal because it's illegal. But then if you say, but should it be illegal, that's a separate matter. If someone says, well, it wouldn't be a crime unless it was illegal, so it's illegal, it's like, yeah, that's just saying it's illegal because it's illegal, that's not really a debate. Okay, so that brings us to the end of chapter 7. When next we meet again on the Tuesday, we'll head into chapter 8, looking at our first look at arguments in more detail. So have a good rest of the week. If you